Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to lesson 10b. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about democracy and modernism, and really in the space of really just a little over a quarter, we have gone from the Renaissance, at the end of the Dark Ages, to really the first little bit of what we would say is kind of our modern day. So some of the things that we see when we look at the globe today, for example, in terms of countries, the way that countries work together, the interactions, and other things that lead to our current world really are starting to set in stone during this particular unit. So we'll look at that. Also, the rise of democracy, the idea that people control the government. This is something that has been in its infancy up to now, and we're going to see it really gaining speed at this point. So a little preview of what we're going to talk about this particular lesson. We're going to look at the new politics of Europe, a little bit about politics in North America, some new ideas in science and art that bring us into the modern day, and the idea of anti-Semitism, which means anti-Jewish feelings around the world, and Zionism, which is the idea that Jewish people want to have a homeland in the Middle East and the important areas around what is today the nation of Israel. So those we're going to look at today. Some reading, you're going to finish up chapter 20. This is pages 629 to 634, and then your assignment 10b will be based on those pages. You're going to see some new terms. Those are going to be the following: Duma, psychoanalysis, pogrom, modernism, anti-Semitism, and Zionism. So be ready to define those and be looking for those in context in this particular chapter. So let's start by talking a little bit about the new national state. So we're starting to see Europe now at this time frame, which is really about the beginning of the 1900s, looking at a map, and very similar to what we would expect it to look like today. So the countries are starting to form. Nationalism that we talked about, the idea that culture and language draw people together, is what's determining that geography. So France looks like the area where people speak French, and Germany looks like the area where people speak German, etc. We see that suffrage, or voting for males, is almost universal. So most countries allow anybody that is a male to vote, not always a woman, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And we're now seeing multi-party governmental systems that are responsive to citizens. So the idea that the citizen drives the government as opposed to a top-down situation that we did during the absolute monarchs is now pretty much standard. We see some pretty serious upheavals, however, that happen especially in the eastern part of Europe, and one is within Russia and the Russian Revolution of 1905. Essentially what happens is Russia is one of the last absolute monarchs to fall, and political groups begin to question the Tsar and the effectiveness of the Tsar in terms of being able to lead the country. Factory workers are organizing, even though that's illegally, and they look for freedoms. And in January 1905, workers begin to demonstrate in St. Petersburg. They do it peacefully. However, the government, under the leadership of the Tsar, opened fire on the protesters. That day is called Bloody Sunday, and it leads to some fairly serious uprisings around the country that create a new legislative system called the Duma, which would be similar to our Congress in the United States. At the same time, North America, the United States and Canada, are becoming a little more powerful on the world stage. That's because the industrial capacity of those nations and the natural resources that they have are starting to be pretty important. The U.S. becomes the world's richest nation in 1900, so we start to get our place as a critically important nation at that point. And we are now expanding into Asia. And we do that during the Spanish-American War of 1898. So we actually start to take over a little more power on the world stage rather than just in North America. Of course, just like any time, there's always going to be rivalries and alliances, countries that are looking to maximize their potential by getting together with other nations. And so after the Franco-Prussian War that we talked about in 1870, Europe looks to bolster itself by setting itself into alliances. And we have a couple of critical ones. Really what the alliances try to do is balance the power. So if we have one big team that's about equal to another big team, hopefully we won't have a war. And by the beginning of World War I, which happens in 1914, there are two major alliances in Europe. One is called the Triple Alliance, The main players in that one are Germany, Italy, and Austro-Hungary. And then we have the Triple Entente, which is England, France, and Russia, kind of staring each other down in Europe. The United States remains neutral during this time frame, and actually for the first part of World War I, as we'll see later on this quarter, they continued to be neutral. Well, moving a little bit away from politics and into science, we see a lot of changes happening in physics. We have a lot of new ideas, and the technologies that come from the Industrial Revolution give us a lot more understanding of the world around us. Marie Curie discovers radiation and looks at the very, very small, the atomic world. Albert Einstein, of course, very, very famous physicist, makes new discoveries about space and time and how our universe works together, and gravity. We're also seeing some social sciences that begin to gain some power. One is psychology, and that's headed up by a very important psychoanalyst named Sigmund Freud. And really the idea is to attempt to bring out repressed ideas within the human mind to help heal mental disorders. So it's really a look at the way the mind works and how we can medically help people that are having issues related to that. Darwinism, the idea that human beings have progressed and become more and more complex over time, now has a social component that's also being used. And essentially it's used to explain human behavior and the idea of survival of the fittest, which is that the strong in society would naturally thrive without any kind of conditions. So the most intelligent and the most physically powerful would tend to be the leaders, and those that are least intelligent and least physically powerful would tend to be the followers, is something that gains power. And unfortunately, this idea is used negatively also to essentially justify the idea of anti-Semitism and racism in the world. A number of scientists, and we'll look down the road at a science called eugenics, look at physical characteristics to try to explain why one race is better than the other. We see that a lot related to the Jewish population in Europe. Jews in Europe and around the world have continually and throughout history been set upon by the larger groups, and unfortunately this becomes a larger issue in this time frame. Anti-Semitism, the idea of being anti-Jewish, is more common within the nationalistic framework. Jews are outsiders, and they're blamed for a lot of the nation's problems. A very, very famous issue happens in France called the Dreyfus Affair, where a Jewish officer is blamed and eventually is killed for something he didn't do. And the fact that he was Jewish played a large part. And Theodor Herzl begins something called the Zionist movement, the idea of trying to develop a homeland for the Jewish people so they're not continually spread out across the European world and American world. And of course we see this come to a huge issue during the Holocaust and World War II. We also have some changes in terms of art. Art becomes more of a modern science. Instead of classical themes and things of that sort, we're now looking at new modern themes. So the idea of Impressionism and post-impressionism start to dominate art, looking at the world a little bit differently than just providing a beautiful picture of it. Also, photography becomes a new art form, not just taking pictures of people, but actually using photography as art. So those are some changes that we see, some moves towards the modern world during this time frame. And the next time we get together, we'll be taking a look at some other issues related to the politics leading up to the major two world wars. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.